no detections are all below detection limit, there's still an organic carbon component there. And that's the TOC we're talking about. But they're at such low levels that we can't detect them. They're at parts per trillion levels for the individual compounds, and our analytical methods at this point don't go down that far.
Mm-hmm. So in all these, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, but this is the question that regular people ask all the time, including some of our commenters in the written comments we got. Which of those treatment technologies does deal with endocrine disrupting chemicals? I know some of those are manufactured chemicals, some of them are hormones, some of them are
Right.
caffeine. Do all three of them have some sort of an impact on them?
The two workhorses are the RO, the reverse osmosis, and the advanced oxidation.
Okay, so the sizing and the breakdown
The oxidation.
both work on those two.
Yes,
Okay.
and they're very effective.
And I just wanted to also add, I believe back in September we provided an information item with the work that we did for CECs, and that was in response to the recycled water policy. And one of the comments that Keith Maria had made with SWRP was that for UV treatment, it breaks the compounds up for CECs, but we really don't know what the effects is once it's been broken. So that was why I think one of his next steps is that we really need to do more research because we don't know enough.
Right. I mean, that's just one of the issues on which we need to do research.
We could provide you with a list of the occurrence of these compounds in wastewater and then what their occurrence is after all this treatment. But you just have to remember, it's the list of constituents we have analytical methods for. And there's other ones like the metabolites, the breakdown products, we don't. And so you can see we use the ones we can measure for kind of as a surrogate, showing that the technologies are useful for removing chemical classes, even the ones we can't measure for.
So I'm just using this as a chance to ask my elementary questions.
Yeah.
When you say the workhorse, we're talking about CECs. What about on pathogens?
That's a great question. So that's why we have these multiple treatments. And certain pathogens are removed at their microfiltration stage. They're larger ones. RO is a tighter one, so it actually is able to remove some of the viruses as well. But a big part of that is inactivation with using chlorines, chloramines, UVs, and other inactivation of pathogens, as well as the advanced oxidation. So you can see there's a series of these, not just removal steps, but inactivation steps of the pathogens. And we call that disinfection, UV disinfection, chlorine disinfection. And so there's multiple points where that's done.
There's got to be an animation of this somewhere. Mr. Protozoa and all that. How's it going? Any questions? Great. Thank you very much. You did a good job being you, too.
Ready to go to third?
Yeah,
Okay.
great.
So I'd like to start by reinforcing what Jeff said to start, which is congratulations to you and your staff for having put on this workshop. It was a wonderful opportunity for exchange, and it occurred shortly after.
Is your mic on?
Yeah, it says it's on.
Okay.
A little closer there. Wonderful opportunity created by your staff. This occurred shortly after the Division of Drinking Water had absorbed the Department of Public Health, and so it created an opportunity for dialogue within the state board. Obviously, this is an issue that then reverberates down to the regional board, so opportunity for interaction with them. This is a thing that requires a lot of cooperation between wastewater discharges, stormwater discharges, drinking water folks. But from my perspective, you have in front of you today 3 research groups that have been supporting the department, the Division of Drinking Water and Division of Water Quality, and it forced us to come together and kind of figure out what we think are some of the even research themes, even agreeing upon what are these 4 research themes to organize the workshop around, and then to work with the participants to develop a kind of a research framework for the future. So congratulations for having initiated this, and I think it's going to pay dividends into the future. Annalisa asked me to cover 3 things for you today. Each of the 3 organizations is asked to give just a slide or 2 to illuminate who we are. Since I've spoken to you many times before, I'll keep that very short. The second is to talk a little bit about what are the outcomes from the workshop, and then the third is a a little bit about what our organizations are doing in response to what we learned out of that. So SWRCB is a JPA, Joint Powers Agency. It was formed in 1969 to provide unbiased scientific foundation for water quality management. We don't do the policy, we don't do the regulation, but for us, success is when we have the opportunity to come in front of you and share that information and hopefully affect directions that you go. I think one of the things that makes SWRCB unique are the organizations that form us, and you can see that they include 3 classes. They include the 4 major wastewater discharges, treatment operators in Southern California, the 4 largest stormwater programs in Southern California, and the regulatory agencies that oversee them. So it's all public agencies, but some coming from the regulated side, some coming from the regulator side, and all of them being very much affected by the reuse operations. I've been asked to talk about ambient effects, and in essence, what you heard from Jeff is, what we talked about the effects of the water that is in the pipe system, the water that's eventually going to come and lead to your drinking water. But the question we had for the participants is, how important do you think are the effects on the ambient environment? The research efforts have primarily focused on how safe is the water to drink. And this comes into play because reuse is going to change some of the flow in the ambient environment. As you have up there on the slide the amount of water that is called for in your water recycling policy, and that's water that's essentially going to be pulled out of streams. And then from stormwater, and of course as you do either IPR or DPR, what you're going to be doing is taking water that would have otherwise been discharged into the stream and placing it elsewhere, so it will change the amount of water in the stream. Similarly, you have a second issue, and that's as you remove water or remove different types of water, you're going to change the contaminant concentration of the water that is being discharged in the ambient environment. So elaborating on these, on the flow. As you have a water treatment plant that had been putting water into the stream that is now being diverted upstream, you're going to change the flow, and it's going to hit you in 3 or 4 or 5 different ways. The first is there's going to be a chance for effect on biota, and this becomes particularly problematic if you have endangered species in that environment. What happens when you remove that water? A little closer to home, you all have a surface water ambient program, you have a 305B program that you're increasingly focused on a biological condition assessment. And as you start to change the flow in systems, the expectation, the biological condition expectation is going to change. The next is you have effects on habitat. As you start to change the flow characteristics of the streams, you're going to start to change the substrate composition. You're going to start to change the amount of riparian habitat. And I'm presenting this as change, not necessarily bad change, because there are times and places that this may turn out to be a positive. In particular, you all have hydromodification policies. And so as you start to change some of these flows, you may have reduced hydromodification effects. So that's the flow effects in the ambient environment. From a concentration effect, obviously, if you start to take waters that have been treated effluent that's gone out in the past, what you're going to do is, as you start to change the flow that's coming out, it's kind of interesting. It's not necessarily, a lot of the people worry about brine issues. In general, brine issues are not going to be put back in the streams. Those are generally going to be focused on some other type of disposal, usually sent down to an ocean-based plant. And so what happens is less, in a sense, an increase in contaminants in the stream system, but in a sense, a little bit of reduction of waters that might have been serving as a diluent. Because a lot of the water that's coming out of some of your inland plants right now is cleaner than the water that would be in the stream naturally. And so a lot of upstream dischargers, or just, when I say discharges, it could be just your stormwater flows or your urban runoff flows, have less water cleaner water to dilute them. And as you're taking that cleaner water and moving it to a water distribution system. The other thing, again, this also goes now a little bit to the positives, is that you may have load reductions, particularly in the context of stormwater. As you start to remove stormwater to the system, most of your TMDLs and your issues in estuaries don't go to concentration, they go to load. In other words, how much total contaminant has come down the system and fallen out into the sediments of the estuaries. You start to divert a lot of your stormwater, you have a lot less load. Some of that's going to get picked up, as Jeff's saying, these treatment systems for drinking water. It's a lot less load going into your estuaries. So again, an opportunity for positives here, but all things that need a little bit better understanding. Of course, in the ocean, you're going to have an effect of increased amount of contaminants, because typically that's where the brine, sometimes you think about brine from the perspective of a desal plant, but there's also a brine associated with essentially increased treatment for wastewater. And so as you're putting the same amount of contaminants out into a smaller volume of water, you have the potential to create what is now a positively buoyant plume, where the water comes up and then kind of spreads out. It hits that thermocline layer, the pycnocline layer, and then spreads out at distance. If you have essentially a thicker plume, it's now going to be negatively buoyant, has the potential to be negatively buoyant, and fall down and congregate in the area near the outfall. So it presents you a different type of problem than you've had in the past.
But
And of
we might deal with that through diffusers or.
I was going to say, there's a lot of opportunity for dealing with that through diffusers. So that's kind of a background of what some of the issues that the participants talked about. What did they identify as the biggest ambient science needs? Number one, I think with a bullet at the meeting, was flow ecology relationships. What you need to know is, if you're considering changing the flow in the system, how's that going to affect the biota in the system? What are the kind of minimum flows you need? What's the relationship between minimum flows and high flows? And how do those go to a variety of different endpoints, whether that be endangered species or sensitive species? How does that relate to fisheries? How does it relate to the bioassessment targets that you have in your program? The second is you need to develop models to better predict how reduced flow is going to affect stream morphology. And a lot of this goes directly to your hydromodification policies. You develop hydromodification policies. How are the changes in stream flow that result from these kind of things going to be affected by and affect your hydromodification management? And then the third is refine some of the models to look at initial dilution characteristics of denser wastewater plumes. Among the workshop participants, that was the lowest priority, because people felt like that's one that's under control. We were doing a lot. The effort was really more focused, the interest level was more focused on the first one, because that's an issue that hasn't really become a problem yet, but has the potential to become a problem in the future, not understanding those flow ecology relationships. I was asked to finish up by saying, so what did my organization learn out of this, and what are some of the things that we're going to be doing differently? And I'm going to attack that from three different angles. One, contaminants of emerging concern. Second, microbiology. And third, flow ecology. In terms of CECs, this is an area that we've been working with your staff quite a bit. I know you had a presentation from some of my staff on work we're doing in that area. And what we learned out of the workshop is that this is something that everybody wants done. But there's a greater desire to essentially work it out first in the ambient environment. And I think that's a correct approach. Because in the ambient environment, as I start to measure these things, essentially what Jeff's hit it correctly, we're at our infancy in the development of these technologies. And they are what he called correctly an exposure measure. They tell you something about essentially what kind of cell lines are essentially noticing the presence of these things, but not necessarily reacting to. And so when you do this in the ambient environment and you find a hit at, say, a wastewater treatment plant that's going out to the ocean, you don't have to stop discharging. You have some time to figure out, is that a meaningful effect? And build essentially the train of thought process, essentially the structure that goes, if I get a hit, what do I do with it? How do I relate that to essentially a higher endpoint than a cell line assay? And how do I develop the chemical detection techniques? Essentially, how do I become a detective to figure out what chemicals are causing that effect, so that I can now figure out how to fix it? And in the ambient environment, there's a little bit more time to figure that out. In the reuse environment, you get a hit like that you don't know how to interpret. It just causes a lot of consternation. And so the thought process that we have is we're going to continue to develop that in the ambient environment. We've already started to do essentially some pilot tests with some of the wastewater treatment plants We're starting to do some work in streams. And as we develop that technology, it will be easily ported over when it's ready to be ported over into that world. Similarly, for microbiology, we have been one of the leaders in developing those molecular tools that Jeff referred to, the qPCR. I think you've even had some presentations from us in the past on that. We've already trained 12 laboratories in the state to do it. About 5 of them are already starting to use it as part of their beach monitoring programs. We're now working to automate those methods. In fact, I have some financial support from you to develop essentially 2 things. One is devices that we mount onto piers to measure the stuff continuously. So in a sense, instead of having to go out and monitor, you can be sitting in an inland place 50 miles and look at the website and see how has it been all night before you decide whether you're going to go to that kind of beach. Similarly, we're trying to develop portable devices that the lifeguards could use at the beach.
I'm having a total flashback. This like goes back to the 80s working with SWRP.
Yep.
Lifeguards as the key indicator species in Santa Monica Bay.
So, but the thought process is that, so one of the things that came out of the workshop is that this is not the highest priority item. It's something that will be potentially useful into the future, but it's not the highest priority. And so our thought process is what we're going to continue to do is develop it for the ambient environment. And as we have fully developed those techniques for the ambient environment, we have essentially a continuous flow-through system that we're operating on a pier. The opportunity to transport that over and make it an inline system for a pipe won't be that hard, and the technology development is virtually the same for those 2 applications. So we're going to continue working on that in the ambient environment, and when the opportunity presents itself, it won't be that hard to port over. I think the one that really is causing us to rethink a little bit of some of our research is in the flow ecology. This is an area that SWRP is already doing work. We've been obviously big supporters of scientific foundation supporters for you within your hydromodification arena. We're doing a lot of work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife on flow for fish. But this is an area we see really an opportunity to expand. And we see obviously some multiple opportunities. Flow ecology implications for bioassessment endpoints. We've been the group that's been helping you develop those bioassessment endpoints. So how do we now go in and start to take a look at different streams where we've been doing bioassessments and say, how is flow affecting those? And again, a better feel for that. Improved models for low flow effects on water quality. Just a tremendous opportunity there for research. And then, again, tying all this back into your hydromodification policy. So I think that's where you're going to see us going, and I'm glad to answer any questions.
One, it's really an observation as much as a question. In the 2 presentations that we've heard so far, and I'm looking forward to yours, we've seen that there can be research done in one area on one thing, like DPR, can have applications for other things, and that may be able to be put into practice faster than DPR, or more safely, or whatever. And that's kind of your ambient moving into your pipe. If you know, you can do the ambient work, but you can move it upstream as well into a pipe. And so I think it would be maybe this would be directed at us as these research topics are chosen and are implemented, to have something of a little checklist of where else these actions might get applied. Because what I'm worried about on DPR, to be quite frank, is it's very exciting, and it's, wow, it is so like whiz bang, great. And you can imagine that it might be cheaper, or eventually, or somehow. But what I'm afraid of is that it's going to take a long time. And meanwhile, there's tons of stuff that could be done, needs to be done, that we're relying on for indirect potable as well as just regular old, plain old recycled water. And so it'd be nice to have that checklist so that we know that our investment is not just on this, this big shiny object, but it actually could serve many other areas as well. Thank you.
So Fran, I think you're right on the money. I think that's one of the, the real strengths of pulling this workshop together, is it got these groups that are all working on these issues, but from slightly different angles, all talking to each other, and I think you'll see an increased level of coordination and essentially transference across these different endpoints of interest. So.
Madam Chair, I think time is up. We're going for the 600 minutes instead of the 6.
Oh, yeah, 600 minutes, yeah, keep going, this is great.
Oh, I'm in a different. Well, while they're teeing that up, Madam Chair, members of the board, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. We had, both Julie and I had a fun and exciting trip out yesterday from the East Coast, which got slammed at the exact moment that we were leaving town, but we are definitely happy to be here.
At least
nice
it's not
and
Winter
warm.
Storm Marcus like the last one.
It's nice and warm. Julie Minton is to my right. Julie is our research director. She has a great team. As you'll see from my presentation, we don't actually do any research. We manage the process and use a competitive bid process to get research done. So it's a little different process than some of the other organizations. I also want to take a second real quick and introduce Jennifer West, who is behind me somewhere. Our California managing director. She hasn't run out screaming yet.
She's got the whole center. It's like a Woody Allen movie. She's got the whole.
Jennifer
theater
is
stuff
our
over there.
California managing director, a critical partner with us, and a great local contact for you, too. She is literally 2 blocks away. We walked over from her office. And also, while I'm thinking about it, on our RAC, our Research Advisory Committee, Shala sits on that representing your staff, so that's great. My name is Melissa Meeker. I'm actually new to this job, so I wanted to give you 2 seconds on my background. I came up from South Florida, greatly enjoying the winter weather. I've never had a winter before my entire life, so it's quite a rude awakening, or cold awakening. But it's been great. Fantastic organizations, water reuses. My previous experience is both as Deputy Secretary of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and also as Executive Director of the South Florida Water Management District, which handles 1/3 of the population's water supply, flood protection, and a whole bunch of other wonderful regulatory programs.
Yeah, the water management system in Florida is amazing.
Yeah.
Because you do it all,
Yeah,
including the environmental, all in one.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I will have a question for you later regarding Florida's discharge prohibition.
Yes, would be happy to talk about that. Was very heavily involved. Very, very heavily involved. Now I have the honor to manage the Water Reuse Association, Water Reuse Research Foundation. We really focus on 3 key things: leadership, research, and education and outreach. Today I'm going to talk to you about the research piece of that, of course. Oops, skipped one. I want to talk very briefly about the process that we use to define our research projects. We use a Research Advisory Committee, a RAC we call it, which is made up of about 32 experts, which come from academia, agencies such as Shala, and private sector experts. And they come together a couple times a year and review research ideas, prioritize those based on their own experience, as well as surveys from all of our members and the general public, people who attend our conferences, those types of things, to prioritize research projects, make a recommendation to the board of directors, and then approve the funding for the next year. We talk about DPR research. I can assure you that I don't think there is one DPR research project that is not applicable to IPR and the other types of reuse. We are very focused on understanding public health risks, environmental health risks throughout the entire suite of what reuse can do. This sort of breaks out what we focus on in terms of research themes, and you'll see there's definitely, we talked about operations earlier and how you respond to certain issues, human health, pathogens, those types of things. Jeff talked a lot about this, about the issues that we focus our research on, but I'm here today to talk to you about something a little different, and that's sort of our other, if you will, and you can see that up there in the economics, in the public perception, energy, industrial, and those kinds of things. The DPR initiative is a very important one, though. It's pushing. We were able to raise a lot of revenue in order to put into specific research to help answer some very critical questions as we move in this direction. That's a key focus on what we're looking at. One of the projects, or one of the types of projects that we're specifically focused on, is sort of this triple bottom line approach. So if you think about the triple bottom line and just the recognition that reuse projects are not just a financial question. It's not a question of how much does the project cost and that's all you should consider. It really should be a full cost accounting of a project based on social impacts, whether those are positive or negative, environmental impacts, positive or negative, with the financial information included as well. This is a schematic that shows how you reuse water in California. One of the key things that came out of our triple bottom line study is that it is very important to look at the end purpose of a water that's going to be reused, what its purpose is, and then treat to that. A lot of times we tend to over-treat based on public perception and concern over things when that makes a project not feasible to implement. Mm-hmm. So this is a key component that we're looking at as we go forward. We also recently had a study on reuse, the cost issue, financial factors. There were a lot of questions on, or a lot of speculation that reuse direct potable was actually more expensive. This kind of puts it into context when you look at things like capital construction cost, design, energy usage, O&M, those types of things, what the true costs are. And I think we have copies of that one if you're interested. A lot of our efforts have been on public perception. A lot of the issues that we deal with reuse is really that, and I hate to use the term, but I've come to love it, the yuck factor. So whatever we can do to
You're
address
dating
that.
yourself, younger people don't have that.
Whatever we can do to address that issue, put things in plain speak so that people can understand it, explain risk so that the public understands it and understands what we're accomplishing when we do our treatment trains, and really talking about that. We had a very sort of a landmark study that was started in 2013, focused on public perception. This project is currently in phase 2. It started with a number of surveys, interviews, focus groups, all kinds of things to understand the best ways to communicate issues like potable reuse to the public. And out of this project, they came up with model communications plans for both the community level as well as the statewide level. Phase 2 has taken us into tool development, which will help us plug into those communication plans so that at a state level, whether it's Jennifer or even the agency wants to move forward with some public information campaign stuff, as well as local agencies as they move forward with project development, have the tools, animations of treatments, these kinds of things that will help us better explain very complex issues to the public. Out of that, I want to show you some highlights on some of the polling, because I think I could do a whole presentation just on the polling results, but these are some of the key ones that I think are important for you to know. The people that were asked the question in the polls specifically asked whether they were confident that it was possible to treat water. And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. We think it is definitely possible for you to do it. Doesn't mean they were ready to drink it, but they were definitely, they understood that it was possible. If you are going to do it, we want to call it purified, which, Madam Chair, you said earlier. Mm-hmm. One of the great things that I got out of it was that there was this recognition and actually demonstrated results that if you sat down and you explained the treatment process to people, they got it. And they may have started off saying no way in the beginning, with a little education and engagement on the treatment processes and how they should care and how they need to understand things, they came around. So that sort of sets the stage for the workshop and what our group focused on. Great group discussion, and they had some good ideas in terms, but you'll see they're sort of all over the place. I'm the other again. So one of the things, we had a lot of discussion about terminology. I think all 4 of my groups brought up terminology, and taking that technical engineer speak and putting it into plain speak for the public is very important. The average, actually, I wouldn't even say average, most people don't even know where their water comes from, and they certainly don't understand the urban water cycle. So we have got to do a better job of engaging our public and talking to them first about big issues before you throw out a very complex project. They need to have a base understanding. And we need to figure out where, some of the polling pointed out that your minority communities are much more concerned, and we don't translate a lot of things into Spanish, so we need to focus into how to better engage and involve different audiences. And I think one of the things that I wrote down as you were speaking is the source control issue, and specifically outreach on expired pharmaceuticals and how to handle that. I mean, great project that we need to do. Yes, we can't stop what comes out, but we can stop people from dumping in the toilet their old meds that they don't use anymore. On the triple bottom line, again, taking this further down the path, there was a lot of discussion on quantifying the dollar value of this non-monetary. So it's easy to figure out what the financial cost of something is, but how do you put a dollar value on the social impact, or social benefits, or social impacts, or even environmental benefits and environmental impacts? So looking at some research associated with that. Climate change adaptation, very important. You know, these are critical projects that can help with saltwater intrusion or even water supply resiliency, so you're not dependent on rainfall. Further explore the greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, all those types of things as we move forward as potential research needs. There was some discussion about potential impediments to reuse projects. Is that regulatory policy, financial, or public perception? Better defining that and coming up with a list. We've actually been working with another organization on categorizing and updating the incentives from across the U.S. on reuse projects. If that's tax incentives, if it's regulatory expediting, whatever the case may be, a whole suite of options that then governments could look at and adopt if they wanted to. Workforce development, this sort of ties into what Jeff mentioned earlier, the importance of operators being trained and knowing what they're doing. We have a high rate of retirement in the water and wastewater utility professionals. And how do we recruit the next generation and keep them up to speed on changing technologies? How-to guides are sort of my 2015 gotta get it done projects. We are very interested. We have a number of, although you do a lot of agricultural reuse here, we have a number of states that are just venturing into this. So we are looking at developing sort of a state of agricultural reuse, years of existing data, what that looks like, the treatment trains that have been used, when it's the best option, those types of things. Starting with a white paper, taking that all the way down to a one-page flyer that could be handed out to the public so they understand health and safety issues associated with it. I want to make sure, as we continue to see our water supplies challenged, that this is an important and great option for us to look at. Same with industrial reuse. Again, we want industry here because it provides jobs. We've got to make sure that they have sustainable water supply, and reuse is a great way to do that. And eventually we'll get to indirect potable on that issue, but those are the two we're going to start with right now. I mentioned the Research Advisory Committee. The Research Advisory Committee is going to meet in April to look at a new suite for 2015. You'll see we actually met twice last year. The second meeting was based solely on your expert panel and the questions that they asked to make sure that we could get research started so that you have the answers you need before the deadline in 2016. So some great projects. You see how they're laid out, and that's really what we're focused on. So that's all I had, and the future is bright, and we're going to make sure that it's done safely and protects public health and the environment.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit about international experience on this? At the meeting I was at last week, someone asked the question about where DPR has been used in other countries, and much is made of Australia and Israel. Tend to use desal for drinking water and recycling for agriculture, but somebody said Namibia.
Namibia has been the one that's online for the longest, the 60s, I think. They went
that
to,
was just interesting to me.
several decades anyway. So
we do have a case of it being done for decades.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, it's probably occurring a lot more than you think. We have a map which we're just finalizing agreement, partnering with the Australians. We call it the global map. It shows 6 key sites, and for each of those 6 sites where either IPR or DPR are happening, it goes through the treatment process, it interviews the GM, it talks to the public who's drinking the water, this whole thing.
Great.
We are, in the next 3 months, adding 13 new sites to the map. And as you can imagine, a few of those are in Southern California, actually not even Southern California, just California. The ones in Texas, one in Georgia, and one in Florida, which are all, now those 3 are IPR projects, but they're reservoir augmentation. So just great examples. So these are the kinds of tools that we've been working on as a huge focus for us as we move forward to get the message out there. It's happening here. Here's how it's done there. We're going to keep working through this.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful because the idea, I think people are just more comfortable not being the guinea pigs
Not
for
being
something.
first. That's right. That's exactly right.
Cool. Other questions? Okay. They need to be monitored, no matter what. One card, I just want to note that Brenda Edelman put in a pretty long set of comments that were, and I thought her issues were right on in terms of the things that people would be asking about, which is partially why I asked you the CEC questions, but I also get them everywhere. I don't know, she obviously couldn't make it today, but she is one of our key stakeholders. Sean Bothwell, California Coastkeeper Alliance.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Bothwell. I'm the staff attorney for the California Coastkeeper Alliance. I just want to thank the board for this opportunity for this informational session. It was really helpful to get to hear everything that's going on with research in water recycling, so thank you for that. California Coastkeeper Alliance has been a long time stakeholder in water recycling. We were on the task force for the water recycling policy. We've been working on the statewide general orders, the CEC monitoring for indirect groundwater replenishment. We worked on also some legislation in 2012, that big omnibus bill that was going to pull water recycling out of the definition of waste. In 2013, AB 803, and then we've already spoken today about SB 322, that we were supporters of both of those in 2013. Also, our Orange County Coastkeeper sits on the chairs the advisory panel for DPR. And our San Diego Coastkeeper has been a major partner in that Pure Water project that's going on down there. So we've had a long history of being supportive of purified, drinkable, recycled water. And I think the main message I wanted to just convey today is, with the drought, I know that we can get really bogged down in discussions about delta and curtailments and things like that. But I just ask that water recycling still remain a priority for this board. I think people see it as more of a long-term solution, but given how long the drought could last, climate change issues, I think we need to have some urgency now to start getting us to those projects, and not necessarily urgency to build the projects right away, but to get to the water, to the research questions that were spoken today, specifically the CEC issues and how we do the monitoring. I know that for the monitoring, for the revised policy that we did, one of our biggest issues was how do we start to get those analytical models so that we can identify new CECs, which is a big concern for California Coastkeeper Alliance. But yeah, in 2015, really helping this dialogue of continuing to do this research, developing the regulations within your drinking water program, which we're really excited is now here, so we could get those regulations in place, hopefully faster. And then also just coordinating with industry and NGOs on the public perception and building that public confidence. I'll stand here today. We want to partner on that type of messaging and outreach to build that public confidence on a local level. And then finally, the water bond gives a good opportunity. We're very supportive of that. Chapter 9, the majority of it's going to water recycling and to the state board to distribute. What I'd ask is, think creatively about the financial tools you have available to really leverage that money to get the most out of that investment that we can.
And I'm
really
counting on you to engage on our guidelines when we get the draft.
I was just going to offer that we're working on that now to provide our own criteria of what we would like to see. We are working with water reuse to really coordinate on that issue. And we do want to see projects go forward that, really maximize multiple benefits and provide the biggest public benefits. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Along those lines, and I don't know that Sean knows this, but maybe you do. You mentioned earlier that there would be some of the recycled water money in the bond in Prop 1 for research, but it hadn't been decided yet. What's the process for deciding?
I'm not really too sure about the process. I'm not sure if DFA, we had meetings with DFA to, find out what the process might be, and it's still a little bit early on that point. I know $725 million has been kind of set aside for recycled water projects. However, of that goes towards research. I don't know at this point.
Shala may have a...
Fran, this is Shala Farnock. I'll take the liberty of answering the question since I worked in the Division of Financial Assistance before. So basically, the way the legislation was set up, it would allow them to use certain % of the recycled water funds towards research, and what the process they would use is to do public meetings and come up with guidelines, and the guidelines would specify what % of it will go, and if there is any limitations on what type of research, that would be included. And that's something that will come to the board for the board to provide input before it's adopted.
So I'd just like to jump in just for really quickly.
Yep.
One of the things that has always been a barrier for us is we've had very little money to do some of this research work. And having the ability in Prop 1 to do some research on some of the basic issues of that we talked about today would be really helpful, and we'll be working with you all to make sure that we set aside enough money to do that without interfering with projects that we need to get on the ground too.
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's in some ways an embarrassment of riches, but I do think that recycled water is one of those things where we have to be thoughtful, and I really appreciate how thoughtful all of you have been in doing this research. One of the things that the drought does bring on, and I think we have both in financing and our general permit and all of that, put a very high priority on that, as we have on conservation. I mean, hitting all water action plan cylinders as fast as we can, because we don't have a minute to waste, is this dynamic of figuring out the direct potable, indirect potable reuse, including indirect, conundrum of what we know and what we don't know, and not trying to go so fast that we go too fast. So it's interesting, because depending on who you are, there's a different view of this. And coming out of a more public works background, what I sense from my water industry colleagues, both on the wastewater and the drinking water side, is, love of their infrastructure, and the idea that you wouldn't have to do more than clamp another treatment model on and get to direct potable reuse is very appealing to people in terms of not having to do a lot of purple pipe. But there's a timing conundrum where I think some people see our feasibility study that'll come out in 2016 as the same thing as our indirect potable surface water augmentation regulations. And I'm not quite trying to disabuse them of that fact that too much speed could be a mistake, or maybe not, depending on what we know or we don't know. And so I appreciate the thoughtfulness with which you've presented today, and candor about where we need more research. I mean, we're really doing work here that is critical to the future, not just of the state of California, totally for the state of California. And it's important to figure out how to get it as right as we can. So that means to be bullish on recycled water, but also responsible and thoughtful about it.
And I would add to that the fact that you included stormwater with your recycled water folks, I think is so smart, because the stormwater side isn't as connected to the research, to a lot of the utilization. It's been more of a get rid of it approach. And so the more we can bring that in without having to create a whole nother institute to deal with it, the better.
Yeah, I thought in Australia they called them both recycling. It was interesting. Other questions?
I'm sure you guys can fill it.
Yes, we could. I could probably do it myself if we didn't have a chance. Thank you so much. I'm glad you all exist. Gives me hope and faith, and thank you the many people who haven't said anything in the audience who also are key leaders in this thoughtful process. We are going to look back on this era as a really historic, pivotal time, paradigm shift of many sorts. So thank you for your leadership in that. Appreciate it. All right. Very nicely done. I am recessing. We are now recessing until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, where we'll pick up with item number 10, which is our board workshop on the temporary urgency change order. See you all then.